Okay, great. Thank you so much for that introduction, Maya. And I want to thank everyone here at Apex Art for giving us the opportunity to do this exhibition and do all of these programs. It's really, and I'll reiterate what Maya said, the show is amazing. And really, I've seen JD's collection in many different domains, including Barnes, Upstate, and this is maybe my favorite installation. It's incredible. So please go see it if you can. It's free on view, or check out their virtual show. So I'm really delighted to be having an opportunity to share a film that's very special to me yet again. It was made with my good friend Ronni Thomas. I'll be introducing him in more detail after we watch the film. And we also have today with us, as Maya said, Dr. Pat Morris, who is the co-author of the book, Walter Potter's Curious World of Taxidermy. And so this film that you're seeing began because when I was working on the book, Ronni told me that it was very popular to have book trailers that were video, and he made them. And so I got some money aside for Ronni to make a book trailer. And what happened, and I'm sure Ronni will speak more to this, is he got so obsessed with Walter Potter that he took this material and made it into this, I think you'll agree, very, very idiosyncratic and touching tribute to a man who lived. It's hard to even put into words what Ronnie's film does. It's very poetic and very beautiful. And anyway, I'm very excited to share it with you all today and to talk more at the end. And so I'll also say, I'll reiterate what Maya said. Please, if you have any questions or comments, put them in the chat. What we'd like to do is just have an open discussion at the end. I'll bring some questions in, but I think your questions will be much more interesting. So thank you so much again to all of you at Apex, to Stephen, to Maya, and everybody else, and to Ronni and Pat for being here. And I'll turn it back to you, Maya. Thank you.
Well, we don't know about Potter himself because, he wasn't famous in his day in that sense. Nobody was writing biographies or sitting there writing down his words. As far as I can make out, he only ever gave half a dozen newspaper interviews.
I don't know if he was outgoing or introverted. It was a lot of very unusual things.
The taxidermists were always trying to get the best, but I don't think Walter Potter really cared about that. It didn't matter if their eyes were not set right. I think it's just something that pleased him.
This was just what he was meant to do regardless of anything going around him. It made him who he was.
No one that I know of ever looked at Walter Potter's stuff, his great tableaus, and had no reaction. You either like it, are charmed by it, fascinated by it, or you can hold up your hands, I don't like that, ooh, those little kittens, no, dead kittens, don't like that.
What importance is a man? Is the importance of man the life he has led, or the legacy he leaves behind? At what point does the work the man has created supersede his own existence?
Walter Potter was an unexceptional country taxidermist in this little village called Bramber in Sussex, about 60 miles south of London. And he had this tiny museum in which he began to keep his own collection of stuffed animals.
He took the idea of the Cabinet of Curiosity and combined that with a real showmanship. So it wasn't particularly academic as much as it was for show.
Not only did it amuse people that knew him, it also amused a wider public. I mean, he realized that he could charge people a penny or whatever he charged them to come and look at the things he'd made. Over the years, people started making special excursions to Bramber, the village where he lived, just to go and visit his little museum.
So it's been on television, it's been visited by over 1 million people, despite being tiny and in a remote bit of Sussex. I think it became sufficiently famous that the brewery, who owned the local pub, actually paid for his museum to be built because it was bringing in more customers.
His idea was to conceive of something, to put something together that would entertain the most. And I think he wanted to entertain adults, but I think entertain children as well.
To master a common trade is merely ordinary. To persevere outside of one's innate abilities is extraordinary.
Quite quickly, he cottoned on to this idea of setting up animals as though they were humans. So he created the rabbit school and the kitten's wedding and all those sorts of things. And of course, the more of that sort of thing he did, the more famous his collection became. He also was inspired by his sister's nursery rhyme book, including the story of the death of Cock Robin. That is probably one of the most famous single items of taxidermy ever created, and I've got it. I actually saw that case regularly, for years and years and years since I was a kid, and it wasn't till we got it here that I saw it had actually got a stuffed grass snake just behind the bull's shoulder. There's probably things in there that I still haven't noticed. Two of them are crying with glass tears in their eyes, and if you look carefully, you'll see that behind the coffin there's Robin's family, Cock Robin's family. There's an adult Robin and 3 juvenile Robins in young plumage. If you look at the graves, they've all got initials on them, of which the second initial is R for Robin. And where they've dug a new grave hole for Cock Robin himself, there are bones that have been dug out of the ground because the graveyard's been used before. He'd actually make models of the tableau with cardboard cutouts and arrange the things to get the sort of structure right first before he set up the animals. And some of them would take him years. Most of his tableau were very, very keenly observed detail. The animals do actually show the right kind of behaviour. You know, in the rabbit school, there's the monitor lifting the desk and putting the register inside the desk. If you look at the squirrels club, you'll see them actually discussing which card to play in the next round.
After all, what is a man but an animal evolved?
There was so much going on with that. There was so much anthropomorphism. All this human-animal meshing throughout the 19th century.
The groups of animals which he set up to be like humans, I think, may well have been stimulated by a German taxidermist called Hermann Pluquet, who brought across some animals to the Great Exhibition of 1851. They were quite famous. Queen Victoria wrote about them in her diary. They were in the newspapers, and that may well have given him the idea of doing this sort of thing himself.
There are certain points in time that these things happen. And Walter Potter was trying to make them human. Industrial age, you needed that humanity. I think they might have felt they were losing it.
A lot is talked about how, the human mind, we often anthropomorphize creatures, and that's silly and nonsense and the rest of that. I don't believe that. Those sort of boring academics and scientists that are against it, well, they just have to whistle. I think it's within us to do it, and we will always do it, no matter what.
The devil, indeed, is in the detail.
You can see the rats fighting and drunk. They've got their bandages on, and you can just see the police coming in through the doors, which is great. The tables, they're made out of cigar boxes, and the little drinking vessels, they're handmade themselves by Walter himself. And it must have just overtook his life for all that time. It's not just the animals inside it, it's everything else, the background, the paintings. It's got an English charm about it, like an old pub, if you like. I do live an ordinary life on one side, but of course there's this interest in me on the other side which keeps me happy. I'm always looking for something a bit different, a bit unusual. Anything that you see with 2 heads or, 6 legs is just fascinating. And it's just that little bit different, that little bit more bizarre.
Time preserves many versions of history.
In regards to Victorian whimsy, it was such a strange paradox in that everything was so buttoned up and buttoned down and quiet and keep your place and sexual, repression. But yet, in their world, in their homes, there was so much fantasy and fun and color.
The origin of taxidermy partly depends on how you define it, because some people would say Egyptian mummies, for example, were preserved humans. It wasn't really until the middle 19th century, the 1850s, and the widespread use of arsenical soap as a preservative, that taxidermy became successful in the long term. Then it took off.
One of the things that characterised Victorian England was this kind of mawkish sentimentality that also went hand in hand with an obsession with the natural world.
Britain was actually the first country in the world to have half its population in urban areas. And so an awful lot of people had no connection with the countryside or animals at all. And the cities themselves didn't have much in the way of wildlife because they were heavily polluted and so on. There was an interest, if you like, in having a stuffed bird or something pretty as a reminder of the countryside.
The case of Potter's that I own is called Athletic Toads, and it features 18 toads, some big, some small, in a kind of playground setting. Some are on a swing, some are on a roundabout. There's one that's misbehaving on a seesaw, and the old grandfather toad is being told by a younger toad that there's misbehaviour going on. And the whole thing actually moves. It's the only kind of moving thing that Potter ever did. You know, the swings go backwards and forth, the seesaw goes up and down, so on and so forth. It works off electricity. I think it originally worked off clockwork. The mechanism is made out of something called Meccano, which was an old children's construction toy. There is always an excitement and I suppose a snobbery really about having something that you know no one else has got or hardly anyone else has got, you know. There's no doubt that I do suffer from that, you know. I do sometimes think, I've got it, he hasn't, you know.
Let it not be said that everything must die without some mark made of its passing.
In Walter Potter's day, a lot of animals would have come his way because they were being shot anyhow. The gamekeepers would shoot squirrels, for example, because they damaged the trees. And the rat catcher would catch rats. There was no shortage of pest animals for Potter, and Potter would go down to the pub every evening after he'd shut his museum, and he'd have a beer with the local gamekeepers, the farmers and everybody else. They would give him dead animals.
Stuffing specimens was very minor compared to what was really going on with animals on a day-to-day basis.
The attitude towards animals was that biblical one, that everything was made for man to use.
During the 20th century, we get more and more concern for animal welfare. And by the time of the end of the Second World War, people were getting much more conscious of the fact that wildlife was getting scarce in the wild too. Those two factors come together to make taxidermy really rather unpopular.
I wouldn't want anything new that was killed for the purpose. But Victorian, that was before I was born, many years before I was born, and I'm not taking any personal responsibility for that.
I always think about what their life was like and how they ended up being in some flea market or garage sale. And I mean, they're pieces of beauty, they're works of art, they're animals, they're gorgeous. And I do kind of sometimes name them and dress them up at times, but that comes later.
I mean, the taxidermist was simply performing a task. The alternative is to let it rot away or be eaten by maggots. Well, you know, what's the point of that?
They are not as anthropomorphic as some other Potter pieces, but I really liked the story that went with it.
The goat used to break out and feed in people's gardens and eat their vegetables, and so somebody at some stage must have got exasperated with that and killed it.
And then the monkey story. He was a thief and he would steal fruit from the local greengrocer. The greengrocer thought he would fix him, and he had this big bucket of ice water, dumped it on the monkey went into shock, had a heart attack, died, and off he went to Mr. Potter.
He has attracted a lot of oddball attention in recent years, and there are many people now that would regard Potter as the greatest taxidermist who ever lived, which is really a joke.
I have met some wonderful people just because I bought a piece of Walter Potter taxidermy. I've had it for 10 years, and now all of a sudden it's like I'm meeting people that are interested in it and want to film it and want to photograph it.
People have all of a sudden grabbed onto the quirkiness of it, and it's that bit different than normal. People like to be a little bit different now again.
I think the future for Potter probably is quite bright, because I think he's reached a level of celebrity that won't quickly go away.
I've been collecting, you know, antique taxidermy for 40 years, and I can't believe that there is this renaissance, this appreciation, this, you know, looking at it again and enjoying it.
Today we live a different kind of life. We're all focused on the internet. Our conversations are with people all over the world. And there is a kind of interest and a nostalgia, if you like, for a simpler way of life.
He's still got what he always had, which was what we call the common touch. People like it, people respond to what he did.
I was at this store at the time called Goodies, and they collected things from old, like, 5 and dime stores and general stores, and they had these postcards, and it was part of what I know now is the Tea Party. There's little kittens in the house, looking out the window, brushing their hair. There's little crackers, and I was like, what is this? There was no internet, you know, it was just this find, and it just captured my heart, because there were these kittens dressed up, taxidermy, which I'd been already collecting for a while, and cats. The kitten's wedding was a very wonderful experience for me to see. It was the perfect size of what I had imagined, because when you see it in pictures, you never can get an idea of the scope. And to look at all those individual jewels on each of the bridesmaids and their faces, and I mean, what a smile it brings to my face. And trying to like be in that moment that, okay, I'm really here right now, I'm gonna see it once, get it into all the brain cells that I have left, because this is what I've been wanting to see for 30 years. My dream was always to go to the museum, not to buy the museum. And lo and behold, all of a sudden there was the sale of Walter Potter. So I bid all of my money on the two-headed kitten in the glass dome.
The end comes quickly, like dead leaves falling from an old tree.
One of the great tragedies of the museum world is that when his collection was broken up, the Victoria and Albert Museum didn't step in and buy it, because it would have aroused immense public interest. But the curators they have their high and mighty, snobbish views. They're not rounded men that understand anything very much, and so they'd have gone on with their airy-fairy ideas and thought, no, this is utterly beneath us, without realizing that this was a terrific chance to acquire a social document of a certain thing that was happening in 19th century England, and continued to have appeal to the general public for the whole of the 20th century.
This was a whimsical part of English natural history, and to send stuff to France or America or somewhere else tears it apart from its social and historical background, and that's a shame. Things that are in private ownership will perhaps not be seen again for a generation until they turn up in auction somewhere or get given to a public museum.
There's sort of a legacy or responsibility that I felt after I received it. What happens next? Does somebody come in my house after I die, some faint niece that I've never met, and sell it on eBay?
I mean, somebody made this. This was a man's lifetime's work. I just feel that they deserve to be together on display for people to see. That's what it was designed for originally. And they've taken that away. It's not there no more.
Joanna, take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Maya. And it's always so wonderful to rewatch this movie. I get a little choked up at the end. It's beautiful. I hope you all agree. I find it a very beautiful film. So before we begin the conversation, I just want to introduce our guest that we have with us today. We have the filmmaker himself, Ronni Thomas. Ronni Thomas is a longtime friend. He is also an award-winning filmmaker from Brooklyn, New York. His films have the distinction of having been screened at festivals including Tribeca, Raindance, Hot Springs, and many others, as well as cultural institutions, museums, and even cemeteries around the world. His notable credits include a movie featuring the late Dee Dee Ramone called Hey, Is Dee Dee Home? The Midnight Archive web series, which I definitely recommend if you liked what you saw to check out. These are shorter films with a similar poetic take on different kinds of makers and collectors around the world. Really, really lovely. And of course, the film we just saw, Walter Potter, The Man Who Married Kittens. He also just completed his first feature film, The Kaibalan, which will be released this January. In 2020, he wrote and produced and directed the AMC original digital series called The Broken and the Bad, which is an award-winning documentary that goes along with the TV shows Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. And most recently, he finished a short film for National Geographic titled Alter Ego, which features basketball all-star Kevin Love. Our other guest today is Dr. Pat Morris, whose name is followed by many accreditations. He was senior lecturer in zoology at Royal Holloway, University of London, and has a long-standing interest in the history of taxidermy. He's published several books and papers as well. Taxidermy, I will say, at the Morbid Anatomy Library, you can visit some of them. They're hard to find sometimes in the United States. He did a huge, wonderful compilation called The History of Taxidermy, Art, Science, and Bad Taste, along with 50 other scientific papers and 20 natural history books. He is the first honorary life member of the Guild of Taxidermists and a member of the government's panel of experts appointed to assess authenticity of antique taxidermy items. He is also former chairman of the Mammal Society, was a council member of the National Trust, and former chairman of its Nature Conservation Advisory Panel. He was appointed member of the Order of the British Empire by the Queen in 2015 for, quote, services to the natural and historic environment. Does that mean, Pat, that we should be calling you Knight Pat Morris? Like, what? Well, sure. We'll get to that. But anyway, Pat Morris is also the co-author of the book that I worked on about Walter Potter, which was actually just a remake of his wonderful self-published book. So Pat also does these wonderful self-published, oh, there you go ahead, hold it up, Pat. So that's how I met Pat, was through this book. And it was an editor who's friends of all of ours named Charlie Mounter, who saw the possibility of making it a new book in 2013 to kind of commemorate the dividing of this collection at auction and to kind of bring it to a new audience. So I'd like to welcome Ronni and Pat. Welcome, guys.
Thank you, Joe.
Nice to see you. So I would also like to invite.
Can you also welcome Spot the dog?
I'm sorry. Do you want to talk a little bit about Spot the dog? Can you introduce him, Pat?
She belonged to one of Walter Potter's friends, and this dog caught the rats that you saw on the tableau earlier on. And so there you go. And it's actually been That's quite old. It's been stroked a lot in the past, which has gone rather bald on top of its head, like myself actually.
Yeah.
And here's Walter Potter himself.
Wow.
And you can see he's actually binding up the threads on a stuffed sparrowhawk, which is also emerging here.
It's very cool.
Sorry, I interrupted. Carry
No,
on.
not at all. I mean, the other thing that I wanted to comment on that I didn't mention at the beginning, and this is just slightly backtracking, but J.D. Poe and I met because of Walter Potter, which if you haven't attended all these events, you might not know. But J.D. Poe came across Kitten's wedding and ultimately showed it at the Morbid Anatomy Museum for our final exhibition. So I just wanted to kind of bring that full circle. Walter Potter's is, as you can see in the film, really ignites passion and really charms people. And the warmth in everyone's voices talking about Walter Potter I really noticed that this time, how there's no one unmoved by his work, that at least in the film. And there's something very interesting about that. And also thinking about what one of the collectors said, which is this idea of the common touch. And I hadn't really thought about that. In the United States, we don't really have that concept in the same way. But I guess that really means that he touched so many people. And I really, really felt that this time around. But my first question is, Ronni, watching this film now, you made this, it was published or released in 2014. That was a long time ago. How do you feel watching it now? Is there anything, how do you feel?
I don't know. It's because Joanna understates her role in this film. I mean, we basically made this together. So you were there for the production.
I was there for the road trip.
It was a great road trip through England and then on to Chicago. But I like to think, like Potter's work, and Pat said it, you always see something different in this film. Despite having made the film, there's so many intentional details in there, but it's also like, because I don't watch it all the time, and although it has a life of its own and it screens quite often, I always forget it's a love affair with Potter, but it's also a love affair with the collector. And, so it's about a lot of different things in a very short span of time. And I don't know if everyone caught that, but it's not so much, it's about Potter, but more on an empirical level, right? Because like Pat said in the film, we don't know very much about him, but you can glean some information on the type of mind he had by the work that he created. So that's also part of the magical aspect of the film. There's this kind of supernatural, dreamy vibe. A lot of that's thanks to the music of Stephen Coates from the Real Tuesday Weld, who scored the film. But it has this kind of, I don't know if it played very, very, very well for everybody, but intentional dreamlike quality to it, because I just love that I found myself in Potter without knowing who Potter was. As a DIY, somebody who didn't go to film school, but managed to successfully garner a career making these quirky, weird, strange films and get them out there. And, also as someone who is a collector, not as heavy as some of these other people, but like you've seen my collection and I do a little bit of here and there. A lot of my work is about that kind of obsession, right? So like, it's always a thrill to see it, because I've distanced myself so successfully from it that I feel like it's its own thing. It's very much not about either of us. It has its own life, which is wild to me.
Yeah, and so much has changed for Potter since the book came out, since the film came out. And I wonder, Pat, as someone who's been, so I should say Pat Morris is also someone who has, what I really love about what you do, Pat, is you are a very serious scientist, but you also have taken a very serious approach to a very whimsical man with Walter Potter. So, and I love this contrast, this paradox. And so Pat has this incredible collection related to Potter, not just Potter's taxidermy, but also archives from the museum, photographs, paintings. And I love the kind of biological heft you bring to the study of something so whimsical. And I wonder if you might talk a little bit about that and about how how have you been surprised by the response people have had to Potter? Because when you started doing this, there was very little interest outside of England, right, in Potter?
Yes, actually, I suppose in some ways it goes back to my boyhood, because I spent my early years in the East End of London, where there wasn't any wildlife except in the museum, and so you know, I kind of felt that going to the museum, it meant that I could get closer to animals. I could walk around the back and see them, and they wouldn't run away. I kind of gained some sort of affinity with the stuffed ones, because there was no opportunity really to see the real thing. But that stayed with me as my kind of hobby interest for the rest of my life. And whereas other people go out clubbing or develop an interest in music or films or play sports or something or other, collect train numbers, I don't know. I've not really gone down that way at all, and this has been my spare time interest. Actually, you saw Errol Fuller there on the film, the man who owns the toads, and with his orangutan there beside him. He says that I'm diseased, and but the only person who is more afflicted than me is himself. So there you go. Take that away to the psychiatrist and sort it out.
That also shows it's such a great group. The collectors are such a great eclectic variety of people, from Errol to Pat to Carol, John, you know, to Ben. You know, Ben's an auto mechanic. Like, it shows the diversity in personality, I think, is something that is akin to Potter. Like you're saying, I mean, you can have your academic. Errol's like a, you know, foul-mouthed punk, you know, and he'll say whatever he wants. And Carol, you know, is just one of the warmest, funniest people you'll ever meet. It really, I think they're the perfect people on screen to show the legacy of a guy like Potter.
Yeah, the very unlikely legacy, which I think is what Errol Fuller got at too. This idea that he says that many people would think today Potter is the greatest taxidermist who ever lived, because it's you know, the fact that this guy has had a second life so far after the fact really is quite remarkable, right?
Well, I think we should also pay tribute to the last owners of Potter's Museum, John and Wendy Watts, because okay, they sold the museum because they had to. They needed the space for something else. They were moving out of the hotel business and so on. But they were conscious of the fact that it would all be dispersed, and that's why I've got Spot the dog and quite a lot of other things as well. They gave me these things because they felt that there was a core of material here, so that it would all stay in one place. And although most of it's got scattered all over the world, there is a sort of a core element of Potter's material, and the books, of course, that we've done, which would help to preserve this aspect of English social history, if you like, because it's part of the history of natural history as well as social history, and we should keep a record of it. Whereas for 20 or 30 years, 40 years perhaps, particularly during the 1960s, this kind of thing became so unpopular that you dare not talk about it. Otherwise, people would be quite abusive. They wanted to burn stuff, you know, and we were in danger of actually losing this altogether. In the same way that in the past people didn't like impressionistic art and wanted to burn all that as well. And so I think it's important that we have actually managed to save some of this stuff. And now that people are beginning to take an interest and pay money for it, hopefully they'll look after things a bit better.
Well, we should add to that, and it's not in the film, and intentionally, that it's rumored that Damien Hirst was going to buy the collection in its entirety for £1 million, right? And was unsuccessful, and it wound up going for less. The entire, right? It didn't sell for that much. That's true or not. Yeah, whether that's true or not, who really knows? And
no, it is true, and it's a very sad story.
Yeah, we had talked about possibly having him in the film, and I'm glad he wasn't. Not that he would have even done it, you know, for this thing, but like, I'm glad he wasn't, because it takes it to a different level. He's not the right face of Potter. But it's an honorable thing to have tried to keep the collection together.
Yeah.
Well, I want to pick up on something Pat just said. There's something you said about comparing it to Impressionist painting, and I think that's interesting, and it's something we've all talked about, but I think it'd be interesting to discuss here. Do you, Ronni and Pat, feel that it's fair to think of Potter as an artist? Would you think of him as an artist? I know I do. I think of him as an artist. You know, when I look at the 19th century, I see that taxidermy was a perfectly normal part of everyday life. It was in guides for women to do at home. This was like not seen as grotesque or macabre the way it might read to us today in any way. That's my understanding. And that this was a medium that was present in the culture. And I always felt that Potter kind of did his own kind of art using that medium, but I wonder what you guys think about that.
Yeah, I think it depends on what your view on art is, because everyone compartmentalizes types of art, like folk art, outsider art. It's, you know, art brut, like all these other things. Whereas it's like rock and roll music. You can find a million different words for it. So on that, I think it is, I would think it's art. I would, think it's more high concept than he would have expected anyone would have ever conceived. Like Pat would say, it's like he was just doing this. To have somebody call it high concept art would seem absurd to him, probably, but that's how I would see it.
How about you, Pat? What do you think?
I think it depends what you think art is.
Yeah.
If art is something that somebody has created for themselves and use their mind to do that, be it a statue carved in marble or sort of bicycle tire wheels across a canvas. I mean, that's something they've done, and people here and there call that art, in which case this is art too. But I think at the time it was done, it was more considered to be a craft. You know, if you wanted your pet stuffed, for example, or if you found a dead owl lying in the road, you wanted to have it preserved, you go to the guy who preserves things. In just the same way that if you wanted a wooden chair, you went to a carpenter who made chairs. I mean, it was just the bloke who did the job. And the majority of the old Victorian taxidermy we see in this country has no name on it at all. And it was just stuff that was done because that's what the customer wanted. And there were relatively few taxidermists who considered it artistic enough to actually sign what they did or put a label in with the specimen. Usually the label's on the back, and in which you can see that they were also doing all sorts of other things like picture framing and hairdressing and so on, anything to sort of bring in a bit of cash, keep themselves going. And so I don't think that they were seen as artists. Artists, paint things in oils with big gilt frames around them. That's a proper artist for you. This sort of thing is just kind of another bit of furniture, really, in those days. Nowadays, maybe people are beginning to think of it differently. Yeah. In just the same way that 30 years ago, people would look at this and say it's horrible, it's an effigy, it's junk, and want it burned. Yeah. It's an insult to the bird itself. That's what they'd say. And you get the same sort of divided opinions over preserving pets. Walter Potter didn't mind about preserving his own canary. And today people feel very differently. The taxidermists even feel very differently about preserving pets. And so do people as well. And so, there's a great range of different opinions about all this.
Yeah. Well, there's now a lively debate about what is art in the chat, which is nice to see. We've got a few questions from the audience that I'd like to bring in. So the first question is from Emily Rose Wolstenholm, who says, were any of the taxidermy pieces altered post-mortem by Potter to make them more quirky, or were they all genuinely mutated, such as the extra limbs?
Yes, he did. If you look at the rats, for example, living rats have got quite a pointy face, which makes them kind of look sort of evil somehow. Psychologists will tell you that pointy faces are not popular. Flat faces like monkeys and pandas and things are more popular. And if you look at Walter Potter's rats, they've got flattened faces, bulging cheeks, which make them more acceptable. And so definitely he was distorting the reality there to make it more acceptable. And of course, the kittens all standing up, the rabbits standing up. I mean, that's a distortion as well.
I think she might have meant also the freaks, though.
Yeah, were the freaks, like the kitten with two faces. That cat was born that way, right, Pat?
That's
They
real.
weren't
That's for
gaffes.
real.
Yeah. And I remember, Pat, in the book, you were writing that these were some of the most popular exhibits at the museum, were the freaks.
Yes,
right?
again, people's attitudes have changed. In Potter's day, well, they had postcards, and those postcards of the eight-legged kitten and the two-headed kitten and the four-legged lamb and all that kind of stuff, they were very popular postcards, so much so that they actually had them reprinted. And people were fascinated by them, and the eight-legged kitten, which is one of the things I remembered from my very first visit to Potter's Museum, now nearly 70 years ago. You know, that's a very striking and real thing, and it's upstairs actually at the moment now. But they were something that people were fascinated by. Then, of course, during the 20th century, people were horrified by that kind of thing, disgusted, you know, evil, terrible. And now we've gone back again to people being fascinated by it all, and just they keep asking me, is it real? Well, it is real, yes. It's just a freak of nature where a pregnancy went wrong.
Okay, we've got another question here from Rachel Bernstein, Bernstein, who says, I'm curious if there's been any effort by the collectors of Potter's works to bring the collection to an institution or museum of natural history so that they might be seen and preserved for years to come. It is such a pleasure to witness how much his work is revered by collectors and scientists alike.
Well, as was explained in the film, Errol particularly make it very a good description. The museums were too sort of toffee-nosed and stuck up about this. They said this wasn't art, this wasn't their business, and that they were going to touch it, even though some of the museums, like the Victoria and Albert, had borrowed individual items of Potter's stuff for specialist exhibitions in the past. But none of them made any effort at all to acquire this stuff when the museum was broken up, despite the fact that there was widespread publicity for something like 2 years beforehand. It wasn't sprung on anybody by surprise. And so, you know, I think the museums were, as Errol said, in default there, really. And yes, it's nice that things have been saved, but they've been scattered about. And to help avoid the whole idea of them disappearing forever, we have actually lent Cock Robin to a public exhibition in the Booth Museum in Brighton a few years ago, though it's not a good idea to move it around too much. We also lent some things to a pop-up museum for 6 months in London, where 30,000 people saw things. But then one of them got stolen, and the parrot, one of Potter's parrots, was stolen. And so I'm slightly reluctant to let stuff out. And I know that other people who've paid good money, especially if they've taken it abroad, don't really want to consider lending all this to a public museum for a show. But maybe in the future, one of our big museums will actually stage a decent exhibition and show a whole lot of things. And the Wellcome, of course, did actually borrow some taxidermy, not the Potter things, a few years ago for a show in London. Maybe it'll happen, but it will be quite difficult to bring together very much of Potter's stuff because it's been scattered so widely.
There's a great follow-up question here, Pat, which is, are any of Potter's works on public display or are all in private collections?
Good question.
Yeah, I think
I
Dee
don't
Dee Home
think
might
I
be able
can.
to speak to this a little bit too.
I don't think I can remember anything on public display.
Yeah, I don't think anything is on permanent public display, but things
No.
go on public display. Like right now, right, JD, there's a couple Potter pieces up at Adirondacks Museum. So yeah, I don't know of
that's right,
anything
Joanna.
on permanent display.
What's gone?
Pat, what I think it's Rabbit Schoolhouse and Kitten's Wedding.
Kitten's Wedding and the monkey
Well, I knew
riding
the
a goat.
Kitten's Wedding had gone to America. You're telling me now that the Rabbit School has gone to America as well. Yeah, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, we just saw
Sorry.
it. I mean, it was about a year ago, right? Didn't we? Because we did the screening up there.
Mhm. That's right.
Yeah.
Well, the thing is, you see, that what Potter did with that rabbit school tableau was to recreate exactly the kind of school in which he himself was educated until he was 14. And the school building is still there in Bramber. And you would have the children there all with 2 or 3 different lessons going on at the same time. And all the different sort of activities there, which were rather similar to when I was a kid at school as well. And so there was a sort of very English village schoolishness about that thing, which I think is sad that it's not here anymore, and it probably won't ever be coming back.
We have a few more questions. Karen Silverman says that was an interesting point you made, Pat, about craft. Do you think Potter's approach would have been different if he viewed himself as an artist? Is there more freedom and creativity if it can be called a hobby or a craft? I think that's an interesting question for Ronni too, for all of us.
Very interesting. I didn't even consider that, because for years doing my films, I used to think it was just a hobby. I never considered, and there is something liberating about when you don't have to work in the confines of, okay, you know, and then it worked itself into a career, and I was able to retain that. So I think that's a really, really valid point, that there is this kind of liberating source of, I'm just going to do whatever I feel like doing, versus I'm going to do what I think I'm supposed to be doing. And I think too many artists get trapped in that container of, I'm an artist, I have to dress a certain way, I have to act a certain way, I have to show at a certain place, I need this, this, and this. And if you're, you know, a Potter type, you just do your thing, and, you know, and eventually people kind of glom onto it.
Well, of course, some people have actually taken it as an art form now and are starting to display it as art, and making a living at it, I suppose, and becoming quite famous and so on. So, you know, why not? I mean, they're creating an artistic pathway for themselves, if you like, and, you know, good luck to them.
Okay, we've got another question as well from JD Poe. Apart from being a part of British social history, why is Potter still relevant today?
Yeah, I love that question, because I'm a Brooklyn-born, self-taught filmmaker, and I found such a kinship with the spirit of a Walter Potter. It's the same with another fascination of mine, this Key West necrophile called Carl von Kossel, which doesn't sound like you'd be inspired by this person, but they're these kind of relentlessly curious cultural archetypes. I don't think I think in context, it has a lot to do with England and Britain, but it has a lot more to do with this kind of eternal childhood, eternal youth. And, you know, there aren't that many people who retain that, you know, and like, I think we all do to some extent, but like, there aren't that many people who, to me, represents what I value most in people, which is this kind of eternally, you know, he's like a 4-year-old playing with Play-Doh. He just used taxidermy as his medium to kind of convey what was in his brain. So, and his creations are imbued with story, which is, you know, that's decidedly human, right? That has very little to do with Britain and a lot more to do with being human. So I think that's a major attraction for me.
Yeah, and for me, I've done a bit of taxidermy because I wanted to see how it's done. So I read the books and I did it. And if you do it and see how bad it is, you do it a bit better next time. And that helps you understand. You can actually transfer your own mind into the mind of people who did this 100 years ago. You can understand the problems that they faced. You understand that you can't stuff an owl the same way that you can stuff a kestrel or something, you know, because the head's too big. You know, there's all sorts of little things like this which I find very, very interesting in a practical kind of sense. I don't see it as being art so much, but also when you think of somebody, a stamp collector, for example, there are only bits of paper with stuff printed on them. So what's the interest? But the interest is in fact the story that stamp tells. You know, where it's been, where it's come from, how much it cost, and how old is it? It's part of the history of a whole development of human activity and communication. So those little bits of paper really, really mean something to people, in the same way that some of my things, you know, have got a good story behind them. It's got a bird killed by a golf ball, and there's a big story behind that as well, believe it or not. And that's what fascinates me as well, you know, and thinking about Potter's Sparrowhawk here, the way that's done, I know the mistake he made, which is why this is actually barrel chested. He made the false body too big and then thought, oh damn, he wasn't going to take it back to bits and try again, because that would take another 3 hours. And so he's gone on and finished up with the Sparrowhawk that bulges rather like the way Sparrowhawks don't.
Also the tenacity too. He was tenacious. I mean, he was productive. I mean, most people don't produce so much as, you know, a room full. He had a whole, you know, that's.
Well, he did this to earn a living, don't forget. I mean, he was selling stuff to bring in a bit of money. He was selling potted plants out of his garden, and he was charging people sixpence to go around his museum. I think he was charging double that for the French when they came over to the language schools in Brighton.
Good for him.
Sorry.
Okay, so we have just a few minutes left. I want to ask the audience, does anyone else have any more questions? Or Ronni or Pat, is there anything that you'd like to say? Any final statements on Potter or the film, or something that came up for that was new today?
Oh, I'd like to say how good my book on the history of taxidermy is, on account of the fact that it's got also a very good chapter in it on American taxidermy and why that was different in its motivations and creativity to a lot of the stuff that was produced here. And in fact, excellence is what was developed in American museums, not in British or European ones. And there's a question about why? How did that happen? And that's in my book as well, about chapter 11. I commend it to you.
And I can tell you that if you live in Brooklyn, New York, you can come visit Pat's book. We have a taxidermy section at the Morbid Anatomy Library, which is open free on Saturdays. So come visit Pat's books there. Oh, we have another question from the audience, then I'll come back to you, Ronni, for a final statement. Was Potter's work collected by any natural history or science museums?
Not collected by, no. 1 or 2 museums have got an odd piece that's finished up there because someone has died and their children have given it to the museum. But that's just a chance event. And no one went out specially to collect them as a sort of art form, the way you might collect paintings by a particular painter.
Yeah. So Ronni, do you have any final things that you'd like to say about Potter, the film, or where you're at with all this now?
Just to thank you for all the kind words, because it's, you know, it's really just a blessing to be able to make these strange little films and, you know, meet all these interesting people. And I don't know, I mean, I love that this film has taken on a life of its own. We kind of knew that was going to happen. And I'm just really happy it kind of crawls out of its own and then, you know, gained its 4 legs and moves around, and people seem to really enjoy it.
It's a quirky film, just like the stuff that's in it.
Yeah, it's true. I think that's a great way of putting it.
Yeah, I think it just matched so perfectly. We were a good pairing. Same with the Carl von Cosel or any of these other oddballs in history whose voices really don't get to be heard because they in themselves probably, I mean, he might have seen himself as a weirdo, who knows?
Do you think he saw himself as a weirdo, Pat?
No, I don't think so. He just saw himself as a country labourer, scarcely better than a sort of farmhand or something, basically doing a job and living from day to day and enjoying wildlife and so forth. You know, why not? I don't think we can imply too much into it. He never travelled anywhere. He never wrote anything much. He was just an ordinary village bloke.
Well, one last thing go ahead. Go ahead, Ronni.
I did want to say that something I just realized when he had the music on, Stephen and I did an outtake reel with some of his music as like a music video. I'll post that in the chat. But it's just some of the, but most of the shots, as you can imagine, made it into the film, but there were a few that did not make it. So I'll post that in the chat if you care to see it and listen to his lovely music.
Yeah.
Never mind, they're in the book.
And they're newly photographed in the book that Pat and I produced together. So that was one of the main things that we wanted to do with the new book, is kind of go back and I just want to say too, I know there's a lot of distress about the internet dividing people, and certainly it does, but we all met basically through the internet, through this collecting chain. And so I just want to say that that's one of the wonderful things that Carol says in the film as well, that she's met all these wonderful people through her love of Potter. And here we all are. I know Pat because of that. I know Josh because of that, and many others besides. And that is really one of the wonderful things of collecting that you don't really see when you just see things in a museum, right? Is that there is this network, especially with something as quirky as taxidermy, that is really beautiful to see. And it's great. It's wonderful. It's wonderful to know you, Pat. And I will also say, if you can find Pat's self-published books, I find them works of outsider art themselves, because you do everything by yourself. You lay it out yourself. They're really wonderful. I have some in the library, but they're all amazing. So I want to, again, thank you guys so much for taking the time to do this today. And thanks to the audience
Glad
for
to share it with you.
Yeah.